Nelson Santini, Chief Revenue Officer from BSI. Glad to have you today joining me for this particular event. Today's webinar is on stopping student cheating. We're going to be actually just having a good dialogue related to behavioral biometrics, how we can actually use behavioral biometrics to stop, and we do so by deterrence and enforcement. So before I move too far along, somebody please let me know that we were able to see the slides change. Thumbs up on the chat just to make sure before I just go too far and then, you guys are not fun. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Ricardo. I appreciate you. Okay, so now that I can verify that you can follow the presentation, let me just set the stage a little bit. And before we rip into the next couple of slides, just take a moment to say, why does this matter? Why is cheating and stopping it, more importantly, why is that relevant? And so this is relevant to training classes. This is relevant to certifications, continued education, and of course, higher education. And so I made a quick note in here, and I was thinking, how can I just say, how can this be of importance to the audience? And I said, well, I used to actually teach classes for blowout prevention in the oil and gas industry. And if you're not familiar with that is actually just preventing the well when you're drilling an oil well from actually just completely annihilating and destroying everything above it. And we actually just had one of those incidents in the Gulf of Mexico. If you remember, they made a movie about it. That was a blow-up preventer kick. And so I used to basically train people in those environments, and related other technologies. And to me, it was one of those where when you conduct training, you want to make sure that the people who are taking the training are in fact the people that they say that they are, and that they're absorbing that training, that you have delivered good training, and that has been received through evaluation and the likes. If we allow people and imposters to actually step in and take those courses, what can happen is somebody can basically say, yes, I took the course. I am qualified to operate this piece of machinery. And lo and behold, next thing that's going on, you don't recognize the signs of a major catastrophe about to happen. You have a blowout, in this particular case. And unfortunately, people die, lawsuits come in, and so this is relevant from the perspective that your institution may find itself in a place where although people may not lose their lives, their reputation may be impacted. I don't know about you, but from my perspective, being selfish, I just wouldn't want to have a pilot, who didn't go through the training on how to fly its aircraft on instruments when you have a what you call it, a bad weather day, or I just wouldn't want to have a surgeon who basically got a certification operating on me if it was somebody else taking the exam. So with that in mind, yes, certifications and just make sure that we caught cheaters is important because, someday it may save our lives. To tell you just a little bit about, BSI before we step into it, we've been in business since 2007. We have a complete product suite that specializes in behavioral biometrics, and that's why we want to talk about behavioral biometrics today. Just to give you some street creds, about 10 million, remote assessments conducted with over 2.5 million courses and plenty of students out there who have been taking our courses. So, it kind of puts us in a place where we have seen some things over the last 10 plus years on how people go through these courses and what people do to cheat, which is fascinating and humorous at times. Today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the forms of cheating, going to focus on 2 of them. Then we're going to talk about the cheating and its impact on academia. We're also going to talk about why does cheating flourish? Why does this happen? Moving quickly through the regulations on why, we want to stop it. The 2 mechanisms to stop it, we're going to focus on today will be deterrence and enforcement. And then we're going to talk about, attribution and behavioral biometrics. So we're just going to walk through these briskly, but I just want to make sure that we put it into context so we can make the most out of the conversation. By the way, as I go through these, if you want to put your questions on the chat, please feel free to do so. That way, as I have a pause or as it's pertinent through the rest of the presentation, I'll just address those. All right, so let's go into first the forms of cheating. And there are 2 major categories that immediately come to mind. When it comes into cheating, you have fraud and you have impersonation. So when we're talking about fraud, we're talking here elements that are just related to, for example, financial student aid. When somebody just basically registers, themselves, to actually, be and impersonate a person or just basically just get free education. So that's an example of fraud. Then, purely the impersonation, when we're talking about people stepping in to take somebody else's exam. So I am not qualified. I wasn't ready for the exam. I would like to actually have somebody else take the exam for me. Those are kind of like the two major categories that we're going to focus today. Fraud, which kind of hovers mostly on the financial aid, and then impersonation, which is actually more centered into I'm taking the exam for somebody else, and we're going to be actually just digging into those, as we go on forward. Next, okay, so if we have identified then what the problems are, let's talk a little bit, about, how big is this problem? I mean, how serious is it? And so, just asking you all in the chat, can you all tell me, have some idea, financially speaking, how big these problems are? We're gonna start with financial aid fraud. And so, in the audience, anybody in chat, do you all have an idea on how big this problem is? If you want to quantify it in dollars, any takers on chat? Anybody? While you're actually just going through those, I'll actually, just tell you that, when we're looking into the aid of fraud, right? It's all about the money, and it's just not short business, right? We're talking here $120 billion in the budget of FAFSA, right? So fairly substantial, right? And you have 18 million students that apply yearly to it. And when you're looking at how much money basically falls through the wayside when people are doing impersonation and cheating, it's not trivial. It's about 5%. By my math, that's about $6 billion that disappear and they don't get to the institutions. Of all things, some of the institutions that are more severely impacted are actually community colleges. And this has to deal with the fact that, the element of identifying the candidates perhaps is actually just, not compromised, but it's actually just less rigorous than in other institutions. And so bots and attackers, and we're going to talk about who is doing this, have a field day when it comes down to going after these funds to the tune of $6 billion. That's a lot of money that is out there. So it gets a lot of attention. When it comes down to impersonators, right? It's not actually just, that far behind it. So impersonators, when you're talking about, is this a real problem? Let me just give you an idea here. You have CBS News sizing the problem into the multi-billion dollars element, right? So they're saying substantial, multi-billion dollars. You also have the Wall Street Journal agreeing with CBS saying, yeah, this is like a multi-billion dollar problem. Okay, well, lend some credibility, okay? You also have Fox News saying that this is actually a multi-billion dollar problem. So we have Fox News, the Journal, CBS, and every other entity agreeing on this. And if you can think back, when was the last time that all of these entities agreed on anything, it tells you that this is a serious problem for us to think through, right? It's a $1 billion industry. Let's just, again, just dollars are sometimes, kind of like hard to put our arms around. Let's talk about the volume, right? So how many students are doing this? It's about 31 million, students that are cheating globally. It's almost like 1 in 6 of the total students out there in the world are saying, yep, I accept, I cheated. I had somebody take the exam for me, or I had my mom do my homework. It's about 1 in 6 students, which translates to about 3.2 million students in the United States. And I think that most of us here are CONA, so continental United States, institutions based in the US, there's a good probability that, that's happening close to us. Truly, if I ask the question, what does this mean? The next question that comes to mind is this one, which is, if you can't recognize a mark at the table, okay, well, probably tag, you're in, right? It's happening in your institution, right? As much as we hate to admit it. And so because it happens, I surmise that's part of the interest of being here, you being able to recognize, how do I stop it? How do I thwart it? And how do I basically make sure that we stop cheating? And again, the impact, kind of to set the expectation is just goes beyond the financial, beyond the numbers of people. It is seriously a problem that erodes the trust on the degrees that are being conferred, the institutions that are actually conferring these degrees. And so when you're looking at the reputation of the institution that you represent, the reputation of the graduates that you basically put through your classrooms, that is something that basically will come back to haunt the institution. So this is, again, impact beyond dollars and cents, goes all the way, as I described at the very beginning of the presentation, to basically touch the lives of some individuals who are less than qualified to be operating equipment and or performing some perhaps operations on us, right? So let's just basically then talk about a little bit then onto how the cheating flourishes, right? And so it stems from a couple of factors. One of them is basically having weak identity regulations. How do we identify the people who are cheating? How do we basically prosecute them, if you will? And how do we manage them when we identify them, right? In addition to that, if you basically just want to cheat, all you have to do is go to the dark web or go to YouTube, and literally there are even Facebook pages that tell you, hey, Cheaters Club, learn how to actually just cheat. And so there's no lack of instruction on how to basically defeat the system if you want. And that begins all the way from copying, materials and questions, and just having ChatGPT, for example, give you the answers, all the way through the less sophisticated, but still as important. How do I impersonate somebody? How do I compromise the credentials and bypass multi-factor authentication? Okay. This happens at the hands of lone actors. This happens at the hands of organized crime, and this happens also, through automation like AI and ML. And so we're going to talk about those, how to recognize them with the biometrics and the likes, and how to basically, put a program in place that helps you stop cheating. When we're talking here, critical regulations that not forces or encourages us to do this, right? We have to meet our accreditation requirements. And in the United States, you have 34 CFR 602. And again, that's sections G and H. I'll just translate to simple terms. Make sure that you have real students in your remote training program. Make sure that they're correct students taking the classes, right? If you want to read through all of the legalese, by all means, please do so. But it's very straightforward. A, teach your real students. B, make sure that you're teaching the right people, or that the credentials that you're awarding or the exams and grades are going to the right people. In a nutshell, that's what it is, right? So this is something that is just a requirement. So you have to prove this. And that's where the behavioral biometrics come on in to stop the cheating, making sure that the people that you're teaching are real and the right people. It boils down to then, from that point of the regulations, you got to have a deterrence and an enforcement element. And so those are the two key elements as we move along, through, again, stopping cheating. Is you got to have a good deterrence and a good enforcement arm. Deterrence, to be put in layman's term, is the juice has to be worth the squeeze for the people, right? And when that is not the case, you'll stop people from actually just trying to cheat. The enforcement side is actually more straightforward, which is if you broke it, you bought it, right? Which means that if you're breaking the rules, if you're caught cheating, there has to be some repercussion. And so one of my points here is double tap on the floor. It's the attribution of action, right? How do you make sure that the person who was caught cheating, in fact, was actually cheating? And how do you basically prove that beyond a reasonable doubt to make sure that you can basically deter others who are thinking about this from taking that action? So one of the things, or a couple of things that we have to think through is, again, to make sure that you don't get yourself in hot water. Hey, number one, make sure you have one-to-one unbreakable identity attribution. Make sure that if you catch someone, that you can prove that that's the person who was cheating, right? Make sure that you also have what's called persistent course validation. So as you go through the use of your LMS, and you're having your Blackboard, your Canvas, and whatever your LMS is, that you have enough checkpoints through the system so that you can actually deter the cheaters. And if they're cheating, that you can capture enough data so you can prove it. Make sure that you actually just have, again, other elements, to help you, like for instance, the global analytics, right? And again, make sure that you're in line with those regulations. So you got to make sure that you have all of these factors in line with your enforcement arm and the data that you're collecting, so you can have attribution. That's the big word here. To stop cheating, we got to make sure that we have a strong attribution of action. You got to make sure that you have that one-to-one connection, and that's what's going to stop people from actually just doing wrong. Because if you catch them and you can prove compellingly that they are actually the ones who are cheating, then you can actually just take action, and then the word goes outside, becomes a deterrent. So it's one of those loops that feeds one to the other one. You got to make sure that you have that one-to-one unbreakable bond, and you got to make sure that you're validating that bond between the real person and that digital avatar, that manifestation online, which represents itself into the video capture, or when you're doing, for example, proctoring, and or the data that you're actually just collecting from people, with their permission, to make sure that you can recreate the scene and say, okay, looks like in this particular exam, somebody was cheating, and here's why I can reconstruct it, because the AI ML models can actually just, present that picture for you. Okay. And one of the key points here is to say that it doesn't matter how cool your analytics are. It doesn't matter how robust they are. If you don't have the element of attribution, it's probably just basically just wasting a little bit of time. And so that's actually just one of the key elements as we step now. Let's just look at some of the data, and let's look at some of the charts, so we can begin to see how do we recognize and how we can begin to stop cheating when it comes down to remote proctoring and or testing online. Right. So let's just talk about behavioral analytics. And so the next couple of slides, are just going to be talking about some examples of some of the elements in cheating and how you can recognize them using behavioral analytics, beginning from the premise of you're collecting data, and all of this data is attributed one-to-one in a compelling fashion to the person who's actually just breaking the rules, right? So with that said, again, if you have some questions, make sure you pipe up on the chat. Let me know as we go along. So let's begin with an easy one. Stopping bots. And so everybody talks about bots basically just registering for people. And so this one kind of applies to the financial aid, where you may have a group of bots that may be just bombarding a portal where you're going to be applying for financial aid or registering to a school. And so examples of this manifestation is against the fake students enrolling for class or fake financial aid claims. Okay. How can you tell that you have a bot in line? Well, in some of the simple instances, you can recognize the bursty behavior, or you can recognize synchronized behavior. By that, I mean that you may have multiple portals, multiple registries to different classes, and all of a sudden you basically have classrooms that automatically fill or filled by one particular profile of student. I mean, I'm not going to say that you, for example, would have a complete class that would magically happen to be fully registered for only one kind of student, say athletes, if we were going to go down that path, or from, foreign students, in one class only. I mean, those populations, that density of population and the concentration is very rare. So you would have either bursty behavior, synchronized behavior, and you would also see that, the hits would come in with flash, agility, and speed. And so if you look on the right-hand side, and if you look at that chart, it's actually just plotted on logarithmic scale so that we can actually see it. But if you look at the blue bars, basically those blue bars at the top are in the thousands of hits. And then you can see that in the yellow or orange, depending how you have your screen, those are in the single digits, like tens and onesies and twosies, right? And so when you're looking at the data and the volume of people, it's bursty behavior that hides itself. So you need to have a machine that is going to be able to recognize this. That's the AI component. And then that one-to-one attribution. So you can say, yes, from the 10,000 samples that we collected that day, that one was a human, or in that hour, I should say, that was a human, or that was a machine. So you begin to kind of like build up on patterns and recognize this behavior, as you can see, by the chart and how it's plotted. Or if you actually just want to take another look at it from a different perspective, you can begin to actually have tools, again, like our behavioral biometrics, which would recognize when a bot is trying to log on in and immediately basically fails the authentication because the machine, for example, is trying to do something that the password is not allowing them to do. So, for example, in the case of some behavioral biometrics, let's say that the bot is trying to inject a password, and it's just looking through hex codes that are basically replicating the letters on a keyboard. Okay, well, what if I just tell you that the password does not require any input from a keyboard because you're not using a keyboard? The bot would have a really hard time kind of like authenticating, right? So it's one of those elements of comparison where bots are playing chess or checkers. We're just playing the other game, whatever that is. It's not that we're better or worse. It's that we're just playing different. So we thwart the action of the bots by switching the game. So behavioral biometrics like BSIs and others have this capability of basically stopping the bots and or forcing some actions that are not within the capabilities of those bots immediately. So it forces the malactors, the hackers, to stop what they're doing and actually just basically have to regroup and do something different. Right? So these are just examples of bots on how behavioral biometrics and stop them, and so how you can actually just track them. And if you look, for example, here in the data that is being collected, it just so happens that in this particular data sample, you have some clear user IDs that were attempted to be hacked upon, but you can actually say, yes, this was a bot attack, and we stopped it from happening. And so we knew that the user may have been attempted, to be compromised, but it was actually not compromised. And so if there's an action to be inferred, we can say, yes, Johnny was attempted, somebody tried to hack Johnny's account, but they were protected because they were using a behavioral biometric password. So an example of, how we can stop cheating from happening through deterrence and also through positive action. Then let's talk about other cheaters, right? So these are just what I call the lawyers, right? These are the people that basically justify and just have an excuse for everything. So I can't log in, my tech doesn't allow me to do this, or insert here a very clever excuse, right? And so then when you start looking at the forensics behind the scene, you can begin to see that these are people that perhaps may have not attempted to actually just log in thoroughly, may have actually just shown up and not completed the registration process, and or may have actually just quit after trying one partial or one attempt only, right? And immediately begin to ask for accommodation. Hey, can you just cut me some slack? My dog ate my homework and I really just can't actually use my mouse to authenticate myself. When you have forensics that actually show them being able to register correctly, and so you basically just begin to look at the patterns of behavior, and you can see in the data that we're showing, for example, a couple of sessions where somebody may have a challenge, and then authenticates, or somebody may just basically immediately authenticate. When you see that happening consistently in the history of a person, but all of a sudden they call you and they say, yeah, no, listen, I've had really a hard time, I can't log in. You begin to build a suspicious profile that something may be afoot. And so this is, again, back into the elements of like people giving you excuses when you have compelling data that says, well, you were able to actually just to do this all throughout the course. But it just so happens that for the final exam, immediately after you came back from spring break, you're having a challenge. Now, what a coincidence, right? There are other tells that will basically can complete the picture, because in it by itself, one or two data points were not suffice. But you can begin to see how the history, when you're tracking all of this data, becomes a more compelling element for you to build a case and enforce, the non-cheating policy on the student, right? So that's an example of people who are lawyers who are always advocating to basically just circumvent and bypass the security, right? As we move into other people who are actors and who are actually just, getting a payment and basically acting on behalf of somebody else, just look at the lone wolf, right? And so an example of this would be like a relative, a sibling, a friend, somebody who is like the local genius. And let's say that you have somebody who is like really sharp on math. I am not sharp at math. And I say, please take the exam for me. I'm really struggling with differential equations, or listen, on my practical nuclear engineering exam, radiological controls are not good for me. Would you please, take that exam for me? And so the tells in here, when you basically just have this kind of imposters, is that they will know the ID and the password of somebody else, right? So they have kind of like all of the credentials. They may even have access to some of the devices that are used for the authentication, like their phone, or they may have access to their fob or something like this. When it comes down to multi-factor authentication, one of the things that we know is that as it can be circumvented. And again, back to where does behavioral biometrics plugs in. When you use behavioral biometrics and then you inject elements of randomness or elements of, of irregularities, right? Then you can begin to thwart the actions. And so again, you have plenty of technology like ours that would happen to basically stop somebody from imitating your password. And so in my particular case, I can give you my password and you will not be able to log on in, not because the system is broken, it's because the only person that can use my password is me. And that is to the tune of 192 billion to 1, just based on what you're seeing there on the screen. So if you look into the graph, and this is just a sample collected on a particular user where we just wanted to kind of like look at the data from a lone wolf, you can see that the password in this particular case was 2222. And you can see that the person shared with somebody else the 2222 password. And if you look at it, the authentication happened to be with somebody that was not necessarily your typical geographical location. And we're just going to leave it at that so we don't point fingers. But when you find yourself into a place where somebody has been able to authenticate and all of a sudden they can't, and they're trying to go through a reset like I was showing you on the previous page, you can begin to connect the dots and say, okay, I'm on to you. I see you're now having somebody that is actually just not necessarily, say, in the continental United States, but is abroad, acting like a lone wolf, and you've gone out of your way to share your password and the identity. And, this person is actually experiencing challenges, right? And this is before we get into actions like hiding and masking through VPN and other elements. So this is just looking at the components of the behavioral biometrics on how you can quickly catch a person that has been shared information, has received information for them to log on in, but we can still identify them and say, yep, that was not you. I mean, you don't write the twos the same way. You didn't write them on the same sequence. They were not the same looking, twos. And, then other factors can complete in the picture. So again, you have all of the evidence that you need for enforcement to come back and have the discussion with that student. Again, deterrence. And if you want to move forward, then you have all of the evidence to basically put a picture together that says, nah, you were cheating. lone wolf number two as well. So when you're looking at the raw data and you're looking at the behavioral biometrics, so this is less sexy, but it's still, again, the same. This, you have all the facts in front of you. You can see them patterns of behavior. And what I'm showing you here is basically a typical session of a person that is trying to basically just cheat. And so person comes on in, basically just has the wrong validation, request for a password reset, request basically for authentication through a different means to reset the complete profile, goes through the process of registration, and then gains access. And so this is just to show how policy complements the technology. And so double stump on the floor. You can have the best technology out there, and some technology like ours and others is super robust. But if in your policy, you begin to compromise flexibility for robustness, there's a line in which you begin to give people an out based on your policy for them to actually cheat. And so you can recognize them. It becomes a lot more difficult for you to hold them accountable when you basically get to the point of basically pressing and saying, I think that you're in violation of our student policy. And again, I'm just showing you the raw data for you to understand and basically see how it applies to your institution. So technology will get you so far. Policy enforcement is also very critical, but that's a clear example that when you're using attributable biometrics, at least you can prove without a doubt there was a person behind that, and that same person went through this particular process with suspicions that becomes very, very in line with what we collected over 10 years of experience that shows, yeah, this is the clear precursor of behavior that is considered to be cheating. I'm plugging along. Hopefully you guys are still with me. A little bit, come for the 7th inning stretch your limbs, make sure that we're catching up in here. So let's talk about now cheater farms. And so this is a fun one, right? So back to the billions of dollars, we went through the lone actor. We also now are going to talk about the cheater farms. And so this is now more organized crime. Listen, it's a $6 billion industry, plus, right? So I'll bet you there's somebody out there that's right now just basically just brushing up on NCLEX exams and brushing up on other certifications like nobody's business, right? And it's because it's big business. So if you look over here, I'm just clipping the data so we can just show you some of the elements where you have one-to-one attribution to a certain registration in one location. And you can begin to see that in one particular address, you had 126 quote unquote sessions started, for a particular exam. Yeah, that's really suspicious. If you actually just only have a certain number of students in the class, and the fact that all of them will be taking the exam at the same time from the same location, really suspicious, right? Especially when they're half the way around the world, and we're going to talk about teleportation and stargating here in a couple of minutes. But when you begin to see data like this, then you begin to build a pattern and basically begin to build a profile. That is one element that is very important. But remember, the part that is critical is, again, the attribution. Who was in the room? Can you trace it down to the specific IDs? And can you actually enforce it? Because clear as day, when you begin to put the picture together, how many people are taking the course? How many people are taking the exam? Are they all taking it at the same time? Are they taking it at the correct time zone, or does it make sense? When you begin to put all those dots together, you begin to have a really strong picture. The clincher is to make sure that you have that attribution. So some of the tells over here that I'm talking about when you have these cheater farms, so you can identify them. Single IP address that is linked to several resets on an ID. So you can begin to see who are the students that are legit and who are the ones that are just like acting sketchy. Multiple IP addresses linked to the blocks of a single exam. So again, like in the example that I said, you have a final exam, all of a sudden you have 30 hits from my single IP address half the way around the world, and you're kind of wondering, that's really interesting. Everybody showed up, even though you could take the exam whenever you wanted to at the very same time, and they're finishing within the same period of time. Very curious, right? You get other tells like the recurring courses and professors that are actually just taking courses, and those courses appear to be taken by remote locations. And so it's uncomfortable and somewhat awkward to actually just talk about this, but sometimes you'll find out when you're looking at this data and yet the attribution is at the faculty level, you can begin to pick up some patterns that basically tell you that some courses may be actually more prone for people to cheat, or may prone to actually so people act suspiciously from other locations, right? If you ever had to take that unfortunate action of basically challenge some members on the staff, as well as you do on the student side, you would have enough data to basically corroborate and substantiate your position if challenged, right? So important that you have all of the data, but more importantly, double tap that you have the attribution of it. A couple of simple ones, and this is actually just one of those that are kind of fun. And again, this is just where lines get blurred, but at least you have the facts and you can actually hold people to account. So impersonators, family members, right? Typical one that happens is like, hey, listen, people taking the same course, so close and range siblings. So maybe you have an Irish twin or you have a full-on twin who may want to take the course, has gone through the course before, knows the teacher, has been with the teacher, so on and so forth, right? Or parents or close relatives who are like really good at a particular subject, you will actually just have the tools that you need to actually catch them in the act. And so some of the tells in here is they may have the same IP addresses and volume as we showed before. Sometimes, you'll try people having to start a concurrent session from different locations. And this is where you can have that attribution, and you will see people who are trying to access the course from a different location, not realizing that you're going to fail the authentication. And so you have all the data points that you need to know that Johnny and they on the other side who were trying to help Johnny, that were trying to log in at the same time from different locations for the same course, for the same exam, or worse yet, somebody was actually taking the exam at 3 o'clock in the morning while Johnny was sleeping, and you're looking at the IP addresses and you begin to paint the picture on like, who's related to, or how did Johnny actually just allow somebody to basically take their particular place for the exam and relinquishing, that information. Again, back to policies, resetting passwords, and what you allow the technology to do. You have all of the facts if you want to have full enforcement, if you allow some latitude and some behavior to happen, at least you would have the information in front of you that would help you have that uncomfortable discussion that says, I think that this is somebody in your family based on the IP addresses coming from your house, at a different time, or I think that you may have opened up the session and allowed somebody to reset and basically act on your behalf, not knowing that from that point forward, there's going to be a forced reconciliation or a forced reset where you catch them going from one profile to the other one, because again, they cannot impersonate the other person. So you catch them in the act doing that one. Or if you want to make it more obvious, when you're doing some of the proctoring tools and you catch people in the act, you may see people who just have, other people helping them. So as you see here on the chart, you may have somebody that coming in the proctored exam and showing a second head behind. So it's like, unless you are, from Men in Black and you basically have a head that pops up, behind you, somebody was helping you here. Or you may actually have other cues like different voices within the room, or you may have actually the person who is taking the exam just looking in a different direction, right? Or you may have audio without lip motion, right? And so those are things that, when you begin to use behavioral biometrics and tools powered by behavioral biometrics, you can begin to put pieces of the puzzle that will catch the infractors in the act. Just as a shameless plug, for example, I'm showing it here, what video capture looks like on one of the tools from BSI, where you can see that, the identity of the person is not collected and it cannot be reproduced. And it's because it is actually just using the attribution of the identity and tying it to the avatar, to this blurred image. And that's what is being analyzed by the technology, recognizing what a face looks like when it's blurred without transmitting any PII, being able to ascertain, yep, the person was taking the exam, was actually focused on the screen, or person was looking behind or looking to the side or came out of focus, right? And you have a clear picture that you can use and go back and say, without a doubt, I know that this was you taking the exam, and sure, you were at the local Starbucks, but you had somebody behind you for 5 minutes just whispering or just moving and just kind of like telling you about the exam, right? And so you have all of the evidence that you need to document, because some students will be as brazen, document the whole case. You have the one-to-one attribution, and if you call them to a board to discuss the infraction, then you would have all of the tools to actually just justify the case. So again, these are just examples of behavior from family members and friends or other people who come to help you, that you can just make that lock in through the fiscal and the behavioral attribution, onto the exam. Another element, or another example of impersonators, right, is people who are using ChatGPT and web. And this is a really tough one, beyond the element of having a lockdown browser or similar tool or safe exam browser, depending on what the brand is. Yeah, this is actually something that is really tricky in catching people. But again, when you look again at the data that you're collecting, you can just do some clear analysis, and you can say, hey, listen, this person who was taking the exam, we have a complete history that is locked on this person. that basically says that this kinds of exams should take him, her, or they take him this amount of time, and all of a sudden you find them that they're 2 or 3 sigmas out of the norm. So they're literally like breezing through the exam and being able just to complete a complete essay in no time. This is actually just one of those that that it just jumps out of the page, where you can just say, yeah, there's some suspicious behavior in here. On average, it would take you to take an exam like this 40 minutes. All of a sudden you find yourself taking it and completing it in 5 flat. Yeah, you either just got really smart, or this was your sweet spot. Or it's worth having that conversation. Again, really good to have the data, but the fact, or the most important fact in here is, again, back to that attribution. You got to have this data collected through the semester. So it goes back into the testing frequently, collecting the data frequently. And so you can build this profile, which again, it stays within the tool itself, is not shared, but it helps you build that picture on what's going on in the mind of the cheater. So you have in here, again, an example of very simply how you can begin to catch ChatGPT before you even get into the screen grabs, which can be done before you get into the screen documentation, before you get into having to actually listen to the complete conversation of Google reading for you from behind the screen. You can see all of those elements that, where technology is making, inroads and basically working through cheating. You can have other elements that will quickly tell you when cheating is happening. You have all the facts to be able to recognize it. Coming into the couple of slides remaining here, so let's just talk about Stargaters and clear elements of cheating. And again, depending on what your policy is, you may allow students to reset their password, or basically go through self-serving events where they'll basically reset their persona, if you will. And all of a sudden you find them taking an exam in a location that is in Texas. Next thing you know, boom, they just happen to be somewhere, it looks like in Virginia, Maryland area, basically taking the exams 2 minutes apart. So it's not like they were able to jump on a flight, and we've seen that, where we've seen people basically hop on a plane, take an exam, and just be authenticating the course on their route to, between destination A and B. You can have here people who are basically just violating the laws of physics and just going from point A to point B in less time that physically is allowable to do. So this begins to paint a picture of who your cheaters are. And you can begin to have those conversations early so you can stop the behavior, or in the event that you've been collecting data, you have one final straw. This is one of those clear examples where, again, when you have that one-to-one attribution, you can recognize the malaction, if you will, the ill action, and basically hold people to account. Becomes more difficult when you basically have a really busy picture. But let's say that you're at the institution level, you're basically one of the administrators, and you basically have everybody using some of our authentication. So every one of these dots that you have here is somebody that is taking an exam. And I took a picture of that this morning, just from the different people taking the exams. And so in different stages of authentication, those are all of the people using a particular product, ours, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, that's really curious. I'm going to drill down to my institution. I'm going to drill down to my class. I'm going to drill down to my exam. And all of a sudden you see that you have everybody in your exam, in your geographical area. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, you have people in Sicily taking the exam. Isn't that special? How did that happen, right? Or you find yourself where you have a cluster on a location that is near the facility, but you wouldn't expect to have that kind of concentration, right? This is where you have the wanderers, people that go from point A to point B, and it becomes really hard to find. So you have to discern on what is normal behavior, and what is actually illegal behavior. And you do that by collecting data frequently and allowing the machine to basically highlight those areas that are suspicious and require for you to dig in and find more detail behind it. So again, these are just the examples of people who are taking the exam at a place or location and time that is nonsensical. It doesn't make sense. And so over the last couple of minutes over here, I've given you examples that tie in just basic data that you can collect, but more importantly, that is enhanced by the fact that now you can enforce it, because every single data point that you've collected through history allows you to build a profile that carries no PII, has no identifiable information, no private information, and you can analyze to make sure that you basically can paint a picture of what normal behavior is, what questionable behavior is, and more importantly, that you can actually enforce it, because in the end, you have to get to the let's find out phase, right? So if you want to mess around, you're going to find out. And so we get to this point where you have to use the analytics, you have to use the tools, and you're looking for this attribution to make sure that you're like, hey, I'm going to make sure that we go through after deterrence. If that didn't work, through the enforcement, right? So a couple of things, make sure that you have a policy that allows you to leverage the technology that you buy. If your policy is relaxed, what you're going to do is you're basically going to take the good investment in technology and allow it to be perhaps, not used to its fullest capacity. So make sure that you look at policy that works really well for what you're trying to accomplish, right? Make sure that you link actually in those policies, if you will, by signature to the people who are taking the exam. So this is one of those cases where if you have a policy for enforcement at the exam level or at the course level, when you actually just gonna say, hey, I caught you cheating, you knew that we couldn't use that calculator, but you used it nonetheless. If you basically have that signature, then again, you know that the person took the exam, that actually just cheated because they acknowledged what the rules were. And more importantly, when you use some behavioral biometrics like ours, that their state of mind indicated that they knew exactly what they were doing. And so that's, again, part of the secret sauce of the behavioral biometrics, is give you beyond the technology that connection with the state of mind that in this particular case would say, yeah, no, when you signed that, it was you and you knew exactly what you were doing, right? Like I mentioned before, key element here is just collect the data in ample form and to make sure that you do so in a way that is responsible so that you're not leaking private information from the students and or from the institution. It makes it really simple when the data that you collect is free of PII. That way you're doing a solid to your IT team on the storage and transmission of the data. And the last piece is, to me, the most important one, which is if you see that there's an infraction, then you're going to have to do some enforcement of it. And the easiest way to basically have people basically just make a joke out of the enforcement, out of the course, and again, just to put your reputation at risk, is when you basically have rules that are not enforced, because the students will know. They will talk, they will know that they're cheating. They'll tell each other, follow this link, go to this page and find it. And so this is where we can begin to kind of like help you paint a picture of what your peers in the industry are doing, versus what's going on in your institution. But I assure you that your students know that they're cheating. That, for those who are cheating, they'll talk amongst themselves. And so it's very important that if you have rules to enforce, then you do so. Again, going back to the deterrence and enforcement as your key elements. And again, for one more time, because I haven't said attribution enough in this presentation, it is all worthless, if you don't have the ability to basically go through attribution, because you have to be able to enforce the rules and make sure that you can connect the data to the people who are breaking it. So in a nutshell, that's actually just, today's presentation talking through the elements of behavioral biometrics. I have a couple of slides that basically talk about our technology, but before I get into that point, I just want to know if there's actually a question related to some of the evidence that we presented or some of the techniques that we presented when it comes down to cheating and recognizing it, before we get into talking a little bit about our technology and the unique secret sauce that it has helping us make that attribution. So questions, anybody on the chat box? No questions on the chat box. Okay. Well, if that's the case, I'm going to tell you a little bit then about our specific technology and moving at one level deeper into how you can make that attribution be unbreakable. So when it comes down to then the attribution piece, right? How we collect the data in a way that is responsible, in a way that makes it easy for this policy to be enforced, I present to you biometric signature ID, which is advanced MFA. And so you have different kinds of MFA, multi-factor authentication. So you need something that I know, something that I am, something that I have. Most technologies that you have on the lower tier, physical biometrics and other technologies, complement each other. So you need to basically have them work together. And unfortunately, while they are super cool, super seamless, in some instances, you can work around them. That was part of my business for years on end, making sure that I found ways to circumvent these. And so great, fantastic tools. Sometimes it's just not convenient to have your DNA scanner and or your retinal scanner in every classroom. So you default into something like a thumbprint reader and or facial recognition. And again, that's great, presents some challenges, but those can be circumvented. When it comes down to the attribution one-to-one, technology like BSI allows you to basically have the four-factor or 4 elements in the multi-factor authentication all into one. Something that I know, something that I have, so my password, my phone, my tablet, my computer, and then 2 other key elements. One of them being the inherence, right? Something that I am, my state of mind, which is impossible and to reproduce. It belongs to you and it's very random. And then something that I can do, like how you write a password, and that is very unique. And I do double stump on that one because bots are looking to replicate keystrokes. When you replace keystroke by something that they're not familiar with, they're going to be like, what do I do now? Okay. How do I basically authenticate this? That's part of the secret sauce when it comes down to having an algorithm that prevents you from being duplicated by man and machine to the tune of 192 billion to 1. And we're talking here technology that is just not just looking at how you write a password, right? So this is not a test on calligraphy. To be very specific, this is not how pretty my signature looks. Is the fact that once you have a signature, a lot of people can try to replicate it, but they won't, right? So for example, in 1 billion to 1, so we're talking here 192 billion to 1, this signature here is the same password as this password that you have here, is the same as this password that you have here. It's the same password, 3 different people. They look the same, but when you're trying to compare them, the computer is not just superimposing the images. That's not what this is all about. What's going on is the technology is allowing the algorithm to understand how you write that password, whether it's your name, whether it is actually a pin like in this format, and it's creating a puzzle, a moving puzzle, if you will, that basically changes, how the signature is put together, and then it makes it unique and locked into your persona, right, to your state of mind. And that's what is the secret sauce in here. A password that may look like you can share it, but nobody can, right? It becomes your part of your signature, it becomes your avatar, if you will. You can actually just do it in the form of like a pin. And if you want to try it, you're welcome to come to our website at biosig-id.com. And so you can actually just try, but again, it comes in a simple form, like a pin here, where you can just write in your password in whatever order you want, using whatever symbol that you want. So if you want to use letters, drawings, pictures, it all works, or if you want to make it simpler, it could be even just your signature. Okay. And this is what also makes it very appealing, which is it's hard for you to forget your signature or your own very password, and you can share with anybody else, but nobody is going to be able to steal it from you. So wanted to kind of like give you a picture into how the attribution happens, because this is part of what the secret sauce is, as it refers to how can I take all of this data that I've collected, which is sanitized, it carries no PII, and make that connection to a person so you can deter and also enforce so you can stop cheating. And with that, I'm going to open up for questions so we can actually just look at how we can maintain security, privacy, have compliant proctoring, and stop cheating by using behavioral biometrics. So questions from the team, question from the floor, open lines. And so anybody wants to chime in and have a question, ready to have a discussion. So who's got any questions? No one? Bueller, no one?
Hey, Nelson, fantastic job. In the drawing pad, when you're enrolling, can you start in any field, and is the language agnostic?
Great questions, and I appreciate that one. I'll slip you 20 for the team that up for me. I appreciate it. So yes, on the pad, you can actually start in any order, which is one of the elements of surprise and randomness, which is very important. And you can actually use any language that you want. So it works with standard Arabic numerals, Cyrillic, the Western alphabet, kanji. It just basically works. So it just, if you want to use pictures, it works as well. So it's a very universal tool. It is also, and thank you for prompting this thought, it's also a tool that is sensitive to American with Disabilities Act. So if you have challenges related to illnesses, there's accommodations that can be made for you to get the same benefits. So it would even work with technology like Mr. Hawken, would use, when you use your eyes to type in a password. Yeah, we can make it work with all those technologies and make it ADA friendly. So thanks for the question. All other questions? No one in the chat? Let's see here. That's outstanding. I'm glad. I hope that the information that I presented today was useful. We're going to have the recording of this posted on the web with the presentation. And I see that Andrew has actually just posted there a couple of links with some of the information. So I appreciate your time this afternoon. I was hoping to do it in about 45 minutes. taking a little bit longer, but I'm glad to give you 15 minutes back. So last alibi and questions, going once, going twice. Any questions? Well, great. I hope that you have actually all had a great time here, that you've actually just liked the presentation. If you have any feedback, please, by all means, send it over to me at nelson.santini@biosec-id.com. Visit our website and let us know what you think. And if you have any particular questions, I'll be hanging around here for the next couple of minutes. With that, Nelson Santini, Chief Revenue Officer for BSI. Thanks a lot for participating today. Have a great afternoon.